My name's Simon Garrett. I work for Nature Positive. You might have seen me before. Slightly embarrassingly, every time I look at the Communicate website, I think, could they not find a picture without me in it? I've been to Communicate for most of its life, actually. In fact, all of its life. And I was most of my time at the zoo as well, if you wonder where you've seen me before. But I've changed now, working for a consultancy called Nature Positive. More of that later. This session is all about decision making. So I'm not going to hog the stage very much, but I'm just going to ask you, why are you here? You don't have to answer that right now. It's a rhetorical question. How did you get here? Again, just think about it. You don't have to answer. For those of you at home, you didn't get here. Why did you choose to use the method that you used to get here? Did you really think about it? I sort of did. Why do I think that climate change is so important and yet still drive a petrol car every day? Does that make me a bad person? Questions, decisions. To help us with this today, thinking about how people work, how they make decisions, both individually and also at group level, we have two speakers here who at the back, they're sitting at the back at the moment. We're going to take turns to come up onto the stage. Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who is at the University of Bath. She is an advisor to the IPCC and writes lots of bits of things. So if you've who's read the IPCC documents from cover to cover? All of it, really? Okay. Also a director of CAST. I really struggled with CAST and what it stood for, because it's not a proper acronym, and I'm a pedant. Because there's 3 C's at the beginning: Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation. 3 C's, and you use the A from the and, which people don't usually do as well. I was just asking you lots of questions, which have difficult answers, perhaps. So I'd rather you called yourself the Centre for Answering Sustainability Teasers. I just prefer that, but there we go. And we also have Simeon Rose with us as well, from Faith in Nature and also Instigating Nature on the board. So we're going to talk first with Lorraine about individual decision making, and then secondly, we're going to hear from Simeon to talk about board level decision making, how individuals work together. And then we're going to have a bit of a discussion on the stage. So if you've got questions, scribble them down. We'll have the last quarter of an hour with questions and discussion. Same as online, if you can type them in, and then Ellie will relay them so you can take full part as well. Time for me to get off the stage and let Lorraine come up. Lorraine Whitmarsh, MBE. Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and for the tips on how to rename our centre as well. Yeah, so really great to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. I am going to talk about, it did work a minute ago. As you say, focus on the what individuals can do. Thank you. And a lot of our work is specifically around kind of engaging people with climate change, but I think a lot of the insights sort of transfer to sort of the biodiversity crisis and to other areas of sort of environmental action as well. Obviously, the context here is that we need not just incremental change, we need societal transformation if we're to address climate change and other sustainability issues. And that's clear from the IPCC's work and other work that talks about systemic change, transforming policies, consumer practices, cultural meaning, infrastructures. And at the moment, we're not on track to achieving that. We've managed to cut some emissions from the energy supply. So we are moving gradually towards renewables, but we haven't really done very much in the way of demand, how we use energy, how we use materials and resources. And that's really where a lot of the behavioral and social change comes in. And so the work that we do fits in there. And it's clear from a lot of evidence now that technological change is not going to be enough for us to reach our carbon targets or our wider sustainable development goals. We are going to need very significant changes in behaviour. In fact, most of the measures needed to reach our net zero targets in the UK will require at least some degree of behaviour change. And the figure that I always think is quite startling is from the Hot or Cool Institute's report a couple of years ago, which indicated that if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees of global warming, we are going to need to cut the average UK carbon footprint from about 8.5 tonnes of CO2 per person to 2.5 tons by the end of this decade. So in 6 and a bit years, we need to get from 8.5 tons to 2.5 tons. And when we think about that, it's not just about what we do as consumers. It's not just about kind of what we buy, but it is also about what we do in all contexts of our lives. And this relates, I think, to what Simeon's going to be talking about in the professional context. But it's what we do as consumers, but it's also what we do as citizens, how we, who we vote for, whether we protest, how we invest our money, all of our interactions where we might be a role model to members of our family, to communities, to people around us. And organizationally, we are participants. So within the workplace, for example, we might be employees or employers. In all of those contexts, there are things that we can do, actions that we can take that either directly reduce our carbon footprint or indirectly start to influence other people or start to shape systems. So we're interested in all of those different things. And just to give you a few sort of figures about the sorts of behaviors that need to change, these are the top 10 things that are effective in directly reducing our carbon footprint. That comes from work by the CRED Centre, another acronym that you probably wouldn't like. And remembering that we need to get from about 8.5 tons to 2.5 tons, then things like giving up our car would go quite a long way, or shifting to electric vehicles, but also cutting down on flying, thinking about where our electricity comes from, changing our diet as well. So eating less red meat and dairy in particular. And for context, recycling, though it's good to do, actually saves only 0.01 tons of CO2 per year. So, and I put that in for context because when we talk to people about what are you doing for the environment, that tends to be the thing that people will say, well, I recycle as much as I can. And it's great. And it is helping to address various environmental issues. But actually, when you look at carbon impacts, it's not the most effective thing that we could be doing. But the good news is actually, in terms of thinking about public engagement, that the public is very concerned about climate change. Concern has been rising over recent years. And so now the majority, over 4 in 5 people, say that they're concerned about climate change. And about 3/4 say that if individuals like me do not act now to tackle climate change, we will be failing future generations. There's a sense that we all need to be doing our bit. But we know that behavior change is lagging because emissions are continuing to rise. So people's behavior is not necessarily keeping up with their attitudes about climate change. And so there are things that we can do about this to kind of address this gap, the so-called attitude behavior gap. And the way in which we think about behavior change is we distinguish between interventions that are influencing individuals' choices directly, so-called downstream interventions. So this is usually kind of information provision of some kind, whether it be labels, advertising, education, maybe kind of social influence type approaches. Those sorts of things are sort of downstream. And what the evidence shows is that those things by themselves tend not to be very effective in changing people's behavior. So one review found 2 to 3% effective by itself. That's because information, while it might tell people what they should be doing, it might motivate them as well, it doesn't necessarily make it easier. It doesn't remove the barriers. It doesn't make it cheaper, for example. And that's why you also need to think about upstream interventions, changing the context in which people act. So that might be economic measures to make low carbon options cheaper or high carbon options more expensive, changing the availability of products and services through various measures, nudges or regulation, so actually removing the most polluting products, or changing the built environment, so actually redesigning cities, for example, to make it easier to walk and cycle. And depending on the specific upstream approach, those can be extremely effective. You can completely eliminate certain sorts of behaviors through that sort of approach. But the reason that one of the reasons why information by itself is not very effective is because actually attitudes and knowledge are only one type of influence on our behavior. So this slightly complicated figure comes from the Foresight report on the future of mobility that we were involved with a few years ago. And this was on travel. We were asked to look at what influences people's travel behavior. So that's the blue bit, the blue blob in the middle is people's travel choices. So it was a good example that you gave, thinking about how did you travel here today? So what mode of travel did you choose? Or perhaps also we were interested in what type of car might you buy if you own a car. And those things are influenced by first of all our motivations. That's the red blob. So these are things that you would explicitly say are the reasons why you came by car if you came by car. For example, so economizing, how quick and cheap is it? So is it very quick? Is it a very efficient and cheap way of getting there? Also satisfaction, how pleasant is the journey? Maybe how safe as part of that? Is it nice? Do you have to breathe air pollution, etc.? So those would be sorts of things. How pleasant is the journey? Autonomy, how much freedom and flexibility do you have over your travel? So is there a fixed timetable or can you go whenever? So those would be the sorts of explicit motivations why people would say, I cycled or I drove. Those in turn will be influenced by the green blob, that sort of demographic and situational factors like what's your income? So do you have enough money to have a car of a certain kind? Do you have caring responsibilities? So you have to drive your children somewhere before you come on to work, for example. Those would be the sorts of things that drive your mobility needs. The yellow blob is unconscious factors. So you might not actually say this in a questionnaire, but through other things like actually observing what people do or through other kind of methods like interviewing, you might actually be able to detect some of these unconscious factors which influence behavior. And they're things like social norms, what other people are doing, what's normal in your situation. Symbolism, what are you conveying about yourself through this particular behavior? So it might be that you're expressing your identity through your choice of car, for example. What does it say about you? Habit is in there. So a lot of our behavior is habitual. We just do the same thing in the same situation without necessarily thinking about it. Once you have a habit. So that is a very strong barrier to behavior change. But then in the top corner, you have the transport environment. And I always think we should have really drawn this as a much bigger blob to indicate that this has a huge influence on our behavior. So it may be that you want to, your motivation is to travel in a very environmentally friendly way. And, you have sort of various sort of identity things that you want to express about being a green person as well. But actually, if the transport environment doesn't support that, if you don't have any cycle lanes or if it's not a walkable environment or there's no public transport service where you are, it's going to make it very difficult to enact that motivation. So the context is really so important in constraining and enabling our behavior. And so that's why we also need those upstream interventions as well as the downstream to really change our behavior. I don't have a lot of time to go into detail, I think, about how to do these sorts of interventions, but just to say there's a huge amount of evidence on how we can give people information effectively. Part of that is about giving people really specific advice on what is effective, what can you do? And we know, for example, that people don't know very much about the impact of their dietary choices on climate change. So that's a specific thing we can tell them. Targeting the time and place of action is really important. Could be that you put stickers on light switches to remind people to switch them off, or stickers or labels on products that very clearly convey the impact. So that the time and place of making a decision, much more effective than when you're not. But also really important is targeting what people care about. So think about what do people value, and that might vary across different populations. So you could segment your audiences or the population you want to change in terms of their different values and needs. At the moment, cost of living might mean that people are particularly interested in saving money, but people will always be interested in other things like what's good for their family or their health, etc. And the more you can tailor information to resonate with those values, the more effective it's going to be. And the good news is that actually most of the things we can do to tackle climate change do benefit us in much more tangible ways as well. And just one of those ways is it can improve our well-being. So there's now really overwhelming evidence that actually going green is not about reducing our quality of life, it's about improving it. Across lots of different cultures, we found that those who have lower carbon lifestyles tend to say they have higher well-being, they have higher life satisfaction, and sort of a feeling that they have purpose and meaning in their life. They are happier, broadly speaking. And so the more I think we can talk to people about taking action to help the environment is actually going to be better for you, I think the more we might be able to resonate more with wider audiences. We do need to change the context, though, as I say, to remove the barriers. We know a lot about how to do that as well. Much of it is about making it easier for people and more accessible. So it's about increasing the range, for example, of vegetarian and vegan options in canteens so that they account for a larger proportion. That's not even about taking away choice if you want to eat meat. It's just about increasing the range of options for people, and that alone can make a big difference. Using defaults, putting people on green energy tariffs by default can be extremely effective, up to 90%, according to one study. And then some other things will be much more explicit and obvious. So this is about maybe changing infrastructure, reallocating road space away from cars and giving them to bikes and pedestrians, for example, so that the incentives and the ease and the safety of walking and cycling shift. And of course, economic incentives. One of the most effective things we can do to get people out of cars is congestion charging, for example. So that's been extremely effective. So economic measures work. And the final thing I'll say is that it also matters when we intervene. So I touched on the fact that a lot of our behavior is habitual. We're sort of on autopilot quite a lot of the time. But actually our habits are weakened during certain moments of change, as we call them. And this might be, so this is sort of when the context changes very significantly for somebody. So when you've just moved house is a classic example, or maybe you've just had a baby or just retired. COVID was a huge moment of change for everybody. These sorts of disruptions provide opportunities for us to intervene, to get people to do things differently, because the context has changed and the cues that create our habits are no longer there. So in studies, they found that, for example, getting people to try the bus by giving them a one-day bus pass doubled bus use when it was targeted to people that had just moved house, and it wasn't significantly effective at all for people that had not recently moved house because they had a strong existing travel habit. We have to bring people with us. I think that's critical. We have to work with people to understand what their what might be the genuine reasons why they can't change, and we have to find solutions that work with people to create better and fairer interventions. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. But summing this all up, I think we need to focus on those high impact behaviors that I mentioned at the beginning, things like mobility habits, food habits, etc. We need to bring people with us, co-design interventions that achieve those wider benefits I mentioned, including the well-being benefits that are increasingly being established. Integrate upstream and downstream interventions so that we're not just giving people information, we're removing the barriers to enable people to act, and we're going to get the timing right to make that more effective as well. And stop there.
And I'm going to do a 10-second segue. So that's all about the individual, but as you saw a lot there, there's a lot about the context, and the context is created by governments and local authorities and companies, the people that set up the infrastructure in which everybody else operates. So actually, how do we get companies to start making these kind of decisions to create that context? So that's what we're going to have next. Simeon, come and talk to us about your company.
Faith in Nature. A bit weird having me in surround. But anyway, I'm creative director at Faith in Nature, and it's very kind of you to say I'm from Faith in Nature and Nature on the Board, because Faith in Nature is a very quite established company, 50 years old now. I'm in one of the few places in the country where I don't really have to explain what it does. It's a bit of a heartland for us here in Bristol. We make natural shampoos and soaps and all the rest of it. Nature on the Board, the other thing my badge says I'm from, is a tiny little initiative at the moment. It's a fledgling or a seed of an idea. It's something that started a year ago when we became the first company in the world to make nature a director of our company legally. And there's a lot to unpack in that little sentence. So I'd like to start with this film, which is what we launched with, which is at the time the best way we could explain it in as little time as possible. It also helps me out because it brings the lawyers into the room, so you can get a little bit of the technical side as well. So if we could just watch that first, and then I'll come back to really what led us here. It's all to do with decision making and what it's led to since then.
So there's an internal philosophy at Faith in Nature that nature is the boss. Recently, we started to wonder, well, what if nature really was the boss? It's kind of crazy, but at the same time, we kind of need to be asking crazy questions, I think. It felt right that a company called that should be asking this question. But I can't answer it. So I started digging around, and the more it became apparent that there are people out there who might be able to. So I called them up.
So the plan is to interview you and then stick you to a tree.
So I'm going to be on an iPad stuck on a tree. I mean, I think the idea of making nature a director would probably feel crazy to many lawyers, but I'm a lawyer who is always open to ideas. I believe that the rights of nature will be to the 21st century what human rights were to the 20th. And that makes it a really exciting area to work in. We do need to have nature's voice and nature's interests represented in our legal, political and economic systems. And I realised the ridiculousness of that imbalance when I was sitting under a yew tree that was thousands of years old. And yet I could go on my phone and in about less than an hour create a company that would have more legal rights and standing than that tree.
Currently, our entire legal system, our economic system, our social systems are very anthropocentric, meaning humans are the center of the universe. And the result of this is that we've left nature out of the conversation. Our laws work to protect humans above nature, as if we are separate from nature, which is not true. And the result of this has been that humans have destroyed nature, exploited it to the maximum extent possible because our laws tell us to do that. So I was very surprised to get this email from Faith in Nature. Rarely do we get a company that wants to integrate rights of nature into their corporate structures.
So the lawyers did their thing, and we did ours. And today, we're making nature the director of our company. Nature has an equal vote, same as any other director, same as the rest of us.
Effectively appointing a director that's representing the voice of nature within the company.
That person is independent of the company, and we've tried really hard to ensure that there's a separation of powers, because it's really important that that director feels able to act in the best interest of nature. It's a huge step to saying everything Faith in Nature does is set out to essentially do no harm, protect nature, to recognise nature, to give nature rights, to give nature power, and to give nature a vote. And that's why this is really important.
From this point onwards, we've very literally put the natural world at our boardroom table. We can't be willfully blind anymore to the impact that we're having on the natural world and on the planet in what we do. Faith in Nature is the first company in the world to appoint nature to its board of directors, but we don't want to be the last. And it becomes meaningful when it's not just us doing it. The model exists. We're now making that available to whoever wants it in the hope that other companies adopt it too. It would be massive if there was a voice for the natural world in every boardroom of every business on the planet. If business wants to be the good guy, it can be.
So you okay with the iPad thing, Grant?
That sounds fun. Yeah, I'd love to be on a tree somewhere. I'll make it my LinkedIn profile page.
So we're not quite at that stage where nature has a voice at every board of every business on the planet, not yet. But it does at ours. And Earth Law Centre and Lawyers for Nature, who you saw in that film, really, I mean, that was, at that point, they'd been spending about 18 months pulling the whole thing apart and putting it all back together. So, you know, our articles have changed, the structure has changed, and the framework was changed, the framework within which we make decisions. Since then, Nature on the Board has grown. We open sourced it and it's grown, and we've been speaking to councils, national parks, charities, companies. We've even spoken to banks about doing it. And it, you know, it is happening. Maybe a week or two ago, another company announced, House of Hackney, Homeware's company, interior design. They've now appointed Nature to their board of directors. And they also took the model that we open sourced and tweaked it slightly to also recognize future generations on their board. So, you know, there's flex within it, and they work with the same Lawyers for Nature to flex it to, you know, improve their decision-making regarding the invisible stakeholders that they wanted to work for. And of all places, a volunteer group in the Arizona desert called Friends of Cave Creek Canyon have also implemented it. They just, without our knowing, and you never know where these ideas are going to land, they just took the model. Next thing we heard about it was them saying, we've actually adapted it for our own needs, and that's now what we use in our decision-making processes, looking after Cave Creek Canyon, which, I mean, I haven't been there, but if anyone has, apparently it's Arizona's equivalent of the Grand Canyon. It's an enormous space. So it's, you know, it's amazing to see this thing take off. But what I really want to talk about is why it ever happened in the first place. And that, frankly, has to do with feeling slightly out of our depth in terms of the decisions that we face. You know, it's quite overwhelming, particularly when you're a green company and a company trying to do your best for the natural world. It's overwhelming, actually, to know, well, what is the best decision? Or more often than not, what is the least worst decision? You know, that's actually the dilemma that we often face. And my creative partner, Anne, and I, for context, my stepmother started the company in the 70s. So, you know, we always had an in, and we perhaps knew that we could do something quite radical there because of, well, a friendly audience. But we'd spent a lot of time, our careers, in advertising and branding. So the first way in really was 7 or 8 years ago, coming back to Faith in Nature and going, look, you know, a little tired looking, let's give it a revamp. Let's see what we can do here. And the first thing we did was, obviously, I know the background, I know what the founders have as a vision. But the first thing we did was realize, at that time, it was 43, 44 years old company. You know, many people come and go, and how do you keep that vision alive? Like, how do you keep people actually understanding what the company exists for? So even before we got to the labels, we thought we need to find a filter, we need to find a lens. And that lens was, well, the first, we went into the boardroom and just wrote the words, nature is the boss, on the wall, as big as we were allowed. And whenever people then would ask, well, what do? We go, that's kind of the filter, like start acting as if that were true. And Rivka, my stepmom, absolutely believed that to be true. You know, she'd say, yeah, I'm the founder, I'm not the boss. Nature's in control here. And so the first very superficial example of that was us redesigning the labels and the look and the feel of the company. And so you take that idea that nature is the boss and go, well, okay, so what would that mean if we were to design things? If nature were to creatively direct this process, what would it look like? And the aisles at the time, the natural aisles, were pretty boring and bland and polite and minimalist. And that's not really what nature looks like. I mean, that was a fairly obvious step. So you go, okay, so what would it look like? You look out the window, nature's a riot. That's now why we look the way we look. We changed that. It was a relatively easy change. It went well. it gave us a bit more rope. We were able to do that more and more and more. And that guided us towards being able to say, okay, so that influences the product mix, that influences the way we go about design our offices, all these other things. But it only got us so far. And I think, honestly, the reason those words only got us so far is because there's something slightly inaccessible in them. Like nature as a boss is obviously quite a top-down statement. So we're going, okay, well, the decisions we were now being asked are even greater. By this point, Anne and I were on the board, being asked things we knew nothing about. Like I said, we're from a creative background, so when we're asked questions about where we source or supply chain or packaging or any, any sort of carbon cutting measures, how am I meant to know? So we turned back to that statement, nature is the boss, and turned it inside out and changed it to, well, what would nature say? And what would nature say actually unlocked something for us, because it's so much more approachable. And we started putting that out there, and suddenly we started hearing that being thrown back at us on the shop floor and the factory floor, throughout the business. You do whatever we do, and people say, well, what would nature say about that? And that was amazing, because you're giving people permission at that point to say, yeah, I can question the processes here. I can take power. I can start to imagine what nature would say. And we were able to feel our way towards more nature positive answers. And that was cool, and it worked. And most times people do know what nature would say. We're all part of nature. We can all step in and feel our way towards what is right rather than what is wrong, because we know. But there was still a point then when we went, hang on a minute, as we were becoming aware of the rights of nature movement and the idea of environmental personhood, there was still scope to make that much more literal. That's when we approached Lawyers for Nature and Earth Law Centre, and then that's when that happened. So we've been living with that for a year now. And as luck would have it, in the next few days, we're about to publish our year one report, which details exactly all the changes that have happened as a result. And I've noticed you signal there are a couple of minutes left, so I'll try to keep this short. But in a way, to boil that down to, well, what are the specific changes, the minutiae, that at this stage, I think that slightly misses the point. It's impossible to say whether or not the things we've done would have happened or not without nature's interventions. Nature, I think, is absolutely fair to say has sped up the process. And in many ways, that's why we did what we did. We did it in order to help us make better decisions more responsibly and quicker. It was never actually as a tool to flog ourselves with. Or a force to flog ourselves with. It was a tool to make better decisions. And that's slowly what we're feeling our way towards.
Just rearrange the furniture now, and then the three of us are going to sit on the stage and have a chat. So that's what we do at Communicate. We sit around and have a chat together, and the chat's in the room as well, but also a chat's online. So, and I'm looking at Ellie every now and again as well. Have we got any questions online? We have. Okay, we've got a couple lined up. I'm going to just ask one first, though, because I'm chairing the session. How does it work in practice? So is there actually a person being nature, and do they wear a hat? And
they're free to wear hats if they want. A lot of what underpins the rights of nature work is something called the guardianship model. So most famous example, perhaps, of environmental personhood is the Wanganui River in New Zealand being granted legal personhood and speaking on its behalf of guardians. So the comparison, if you like, is a child appearing in court. A child actually can't represent themselves in court. So that child needs a responsible adult to speak on its behalf. And that's quite poignant, because nature in this example is that vulnerable child, and it needs guardians to legally speak on its behalf. They're not the directors of the company. They're a conduit for a much wider network of people who advocate for the natural world day in, day out. So that's how it actually works in practice. And those guardians, by the way, they rotate. So it's never one person's voice. There's a framework in place that ensures diversity of perspective.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to throw it straight out to the floor, either in the room or, and if you ask a question, we'd also like to know a little bit about you as well, because it's Communicate, we're all sharing. So when you ask a question, we'd like to know your name and where you're from. It's like a game show, isn't it?
mentioned the report coming out soon. I'm really interested in the example here where if it's nature being involved, if it's actually a direct influence on the example decision making, and it then involves something at the corporate level that you wanted to do and actually change them.
There hasn't been that sort of bust up yet, you know, where nature said we should do one thing and we've, you know, voted to do another. Like, actually, so far, it's helped us just speed up, become more efficient at the decisions. I think perhaps we were circling around in any case, but it has moved us in a definite direction. And part of the reason for the report is that at the end of each year, if this report didn't exist, there'd be nothing to really hold us to account. You know, we could say we've done this and then just disappear back into our shell, and, you know, you'd never hear another thing from us. Actually, the whole point is that we share this as we go along. We tell you who voted, what the votes were, how many votes went in each direction. Because of the nature of our business, you know, what we're affecting is perhaps a little further away from us. The supply chain is long, but Friends of Cave Creek Canyon, for example, they're dealing directly with the natural world, and they've got examples of decisions made which are really immediate. And so it's just the nature of, I think, the decisions we're dealing with versus others, but I think it can flex, and those are detailed also in the report.
Thank you. Ellie's got her hand up at the back.
Thank you. We have a question from Matt from our online audience. They're wondering, is anyone exploring how neurodiversity interplays with behavior change and decision making, as diagnoses of ADHD, autism, etc., reveal that far more of the population think and operate differently than previously thought?
Very interesting. Lorraine, I'm going to throw it out to you.
It is a growing area of research. I mean, there are lots of colleagues at my university, at Bath University, for example, who specialise in exactly this area more generally in terms of kind of neurodiversity and how it impacts on kind of decisions and behaviour. Where that comes in terms of kind of environmental behaviour is I think we're just beginning to explore that. So I know colleagues have looked at the extent to which taking public transport, for example, might be more challenging or experienced differently by people with kind of neurodiversity. So I think it's starting to be looked at, I would say, but it's, yeah, lots more to explore.
Thank you. Another one over here in the room. This time I'm going to bring a microphone to you because I think we need to make sure everything's audible online as well.
Hello. Okay, so hi, my name's Maddie. I work in fundraising at the Soil Association. And at the Soil Association, we have corporate partners. They support us, and in turn, we kind of support them to do better. For Faith in Nature, I think something like what you've done makes a lot of sense because you are a very nature-based organisation already. But you mentioned that you've worked with kind of also spoken to banks and other kinds of organisations. So my question to you is, how have those conversations gone? And my question for both of you is, what recommendations do you have for introducing this idea to organisations like banks, which are more kind of traditionally corporate or institutionalised, which might not be interested or excited about this idea?
How the conversations have gone, I mean, we just put it out there, and at this stage, we're being approached. So there is obviously interest within these organizations where perhaps we might not think there would be. Although that said, you know, Lloyds Bank, for example, have now a head of nature. So there are banks that are taking this seriously in, you know, in whatever way they can, and other organizations too. And there's one, actually, like, you've got to do so many talks like this to get one more company over the line. But it is happening, and we are reaching a lot of people and with this story, and I think it'll start to snowball. I think that also what we're noticing is, even if they're not the ones necessarily to make the changes, we're finding advocates and people going out and meeting other people that we would just never have access to. And so that's the whole beauty of open sourcing it. We don't, you know, it's sort of, we can help, but it's being taken on by others at this stage.
Yeah, and I guess I'd add as well as you sort of demonstrating this is how it can work in a really tangible way, which I think is a really compelling argument. I think it's also about knowing your audience, and if they will be more persuaded by, you know, an economic argument, then it's about sort of sourcing that evidence. And it sounded like there was also a compelling economic argument. It helped kind of in terms of improving the business as well as kind of thinking about the sustainability responsibility side.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, when we first launched, I mean, lots of universities are interested in this too. And when we launched, the University of Sydney got in touch with us and said they'd love to start a research program with us to see what actual tangible impact it's had, as well as like the financial and all the rest of it. So behavioral change that we see internally. So we're a year into that now. They've got unfettered access to the board and everyone within the company. And so in a year's time, there will be a completely objective view of the differences made as well, which may tip other people over the line.
Thank you. I'm going to add to that as well, just because now I've only been there 4 months for working with Nature Positive. I've got I'm having conversations with very big businesses that you wouldn't expect to be interested in nature. And I'm an optimist, but I'm even more of an optimist now. The incredible conversations. I mean, you mentioned about banks having heads of nature. Who thought? the kind of discussions going on in big businesses that you wouldn't think were going on. The swell is there. I think this is, you know, and making this open source is brilliant. I think this is an open door, and I think the ball is rolling. Maybe that's just me being optimist and naive. I don't know, but I'm seeing it more and more. I think the ball is moving. It's brilliant. It's exciting times. Yeah. Or can we just hang on? We're just going to get a microphone to you so everyone can hear.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosie from the Woodland Trust. I think one of the things I'd be interested to hear about is how we make this more accessible to sort of the lower socioeconomic groups and that kind of thing. A lot of battery powered cars are more expensive, harder to get. Public transport is getting more expensive and less accessible, particularly in rural areas, which is where you might need it more to get into Bristol and that kind of thing. So what do you think are the biggest single things that we can do to make sustainability like the norm and what everyone can do, rather than it being for the upper echelons, if you like?
Thank you. And that's the answer to my question earlier on. Am I a bad person because I live in a rural area and I don't have any option to drive? Maybe I should just move back to Bristol. That's what I really should do. Anyway, sorry, Lorraine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, you know, so about a year ago, there was an important House of Lords report that was around behaviour change for climate environmental goals. It sort of said the public do want to play their part, but there are really big barriers, cost barriers being a major one. And so, yeah, at the moment, most people cannot afford an electric car or a heat pump. There are lots of really expensive new green technologies that we're being sort of encouraged to adopt, but most of us can't do that. So it does take government to help reduce those economic barriers through, you know, economic incentives and disincentives. But in the meantime, there are things that we can do that are more affordable, I guess. And so it's about kind of thinking about those wider roles that we play. And thinking about, you know, even just a conversation with somebody else about climate change or biodiversity can have an impact. So those things that are accessible to everybody. But yeah, and in the meantime, we need to lobby government. We need to use our citizenship voice to actually say, I want to be able to do these things, but please make it affordable.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just looking at my watch, but I think we're going to take one more. So we're going to keep, oh, there's one more online. Okay, we're going to take two more. We're going to go one online and one in the room. So let's just go online first.
We have a question from Catherine online, who was wondering from Simeon, a question about regarding nature as the boss. So how do you know what nature would want or need, and who gives perspective of nature?
So this is, as I said, this is precisely, when we're working with nature as the boss is a bit of a line, that's kind of what we're coming up against. In turning it inside out into what would nature say, that gets you a bit closer in terms of actually who decides on a day-to-day basis. Because the framework was new and because it was designed for us by basically the world's best earth lawyers, they stepped in to, as nature's guardians in this first year, Lawyers for Nature and Earth Law Centre. They advocate for the natural world day in, day out. That is their role. But that framework that I mentioned earlier, it it is designed to flex, and no one should be in that role for longer than 2 years. And although it's one voice, it's actually multiple people feeding in. So we're about to appoint somebody else from a completely different world, but again, a perspective on and a specialism in the natural world, a perspective that isn't currently heard at board level. I mean, that's actually the beauty of this. It allows people that otherwise would not have a way in to inform decisions that impact the natural world. It allows for those voices. And over time, we hope to just rotate and bring as many of those perspectives as possible.
Right. And I was going to go for one more in the room, but the microphone's disappeared. Oh, but it's coming back. It's on its way.
Hi, I'm Naomi Fuller and I work for Forestry England. I just wanted to touch on what you referenced, Lorraine, which was when you talked about kind of generational voices, and in particular the kind of vocal younger generation talking about their needs for, you know, older generations to kind of take seriously their future. It was really about, of course, there are older generations who are extremely motivated by those factors you also talked about, which is kind of, you know, health and well-being, family, community, which can serve as really good levers for personal change. But I've come across, you know, other people from older generations who have an almost fatalistic kind of, I'm not going to be around when the worst hits, so I think I don't particularly need to change my life. And I just wondered if there was any more you could say about that, and if there's sort of evidence for what does work for particularly the kind of, I was also interested in what you said about participatory decision making and whether kind of generations understanding and listening to each other can help both. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. I mean, I think there are opportunities across the generations and different values across the generations. So I don't think we should be relying on people necessarily to have intrinsic motivation to protect the natural world. Some people really do have that, and we mustn't lose that, but this isn't necessarily shared. We need to make it easier. We need to make it the default to do the right thing, to do things that are sustainable and low carbon, so that it doesn't rely on people to have to put in that extra effort, or to, you know, maybe act not in line with their values. So I think it is important to reflect that not everybody is necessarily going to be sort of out there kind of campaigning and so on, but and that cuts across generations actually. So it is about governments, for example, but also other organizations, businesses, etc., reducing the barriers, making it more normal, so that we have to kind of, yeah, make it the default essentially. I think that's the key.
Brilliant. Lovely. We're going to wrap it up there, but I'm sure the conversation is going to run and run in next year's Communicate and beyond as well. And there's also loads of stuff on the Communicate archive online as well, because this is a topic that's run and run over the years. I mean, this is a new topic that we brought into the discussion here about nature on the board, but the discussion will continue. Thank you very much for your participation. A big round of applause for Lorraine and Simeon.